it a bit different than, a bit different than your regular home Wi-Fi is you can do this either on short hops or long distance hops. And we have multiple people that are coming in connecting over 50-kilometer links, etc. Because it's microwave, it is line of sight as such, so you're not going to get any skip or bounce or anything like that. And probably the other really important thing about this is that it's uses very reliable equipment and fortunately very inexpensive hardware as such. And we'll get into the details a little bit beyond that, etc. And because everybody now has Wi-Fi in, their house, their garage, their car, you name it, all of that equipment is very readily available. Arden as such, we try to promote it as an RF linked system as such, but you're not locked into that. It also has the ability to be connected using your home internet, etc. And there's some real benefits to that, particularly for those people that are somewhat constrained by their geography or the fact that, all of their neighbors have planted trees, 50 years ago and they're all 100 feet tall, etc. So Arden is a mesh network. Okay, it's designed to basically interconnect using multiple links, etc. And the idea there is that, that gives you some degree of redundancy. If you lose one link from, point A to point B, if that link also goes to point C and goes onward from there, this will automatically recognize that it's lost that link and it'll basically pick another one. Hence the comment about self-healing and also self-discovering. So this is not something that requires a degree in networking to get up and running as such. It's very simple to set up. And our very first test, when we give it a try, was for 22 kilometers from Nanaimo down to Ladysmith. And then we drove a little further north up on another hill, and we connected up with 28 kilometers. And one of the reasons we're using 5.8 gigahertz equipment is because we fortunately had a small pile of it in a closet at our clubhouse. A number of years ago, there was a project to basically try to broadcast video of the Nanaimo, bathtub race. And so they got a grant, they got some equipment, they gave it a try, it worked well, etc. They then proceeded to put the equipment in the closet, and nobody went back to give it a use from that point onward. But that was perfect for us because there was some really good ubiquity gear there, and we didn't have to, do any investment. It was pull it out of the closet, do a little reading, hook it up, point one antenna at another antenna, and it started working. So it was actually a little bit surprising sort of thing that it was that easy. So what do you need to do this? Okay. And fundamentally, there's one piece that, you need to have some sort of a router that you can flash with the Arden firmware. Okay, we don't use the manufacturer's firmware for these devices. We basically download, the current version of the firmware from the Arden site, and we can then turn around and flash the devices. And so the one that you see there, the one that's labeled HAP AC Lite TC, standing for Tower Case, well, it's actually one of, it's not the first one they had out, but the previous ones were white for the case, and these ones are black. And of course, they said, hey, let's make it stand up, etc. So this was, largely the basic unit that a lot of people get started with. Okay, you're not limited to this, but I have found that the gear that's available from a company called Microtik is really, really useful for this purpose. Now, since they had those initial units, etc., you'll see the ones at the bottom, they've now come out with what they call the HAP AC2 and the HAP AC3. And they've moved on. So in other words, those units have much more memory on board. They're a much faster processor, but they still, they don't really do, totally different things than the original unit, etc. Just the original unit a little slower, lots less memory, etc. And at some point in time, they're going to be obsolete. But anyway, that's where you can get started. And I'll show you how that integrates in and fits in with the other equipment that you can connect to it as such. Got to remember which mouse I want to move forward to, etc. So because I say, this is available to connect via RF, in addition to that little switch unit, there's a whole variety of antennas that you can acquire that can be used to connect from one Arden node to another Arden node. So the one you see at the top there, that little SXT SQ Lite 5, and ignore the prices. Those prices are not quite as nice and low as they were a few years ago, etc. But that little unit is 6 inches by 6 inches. And that allows me to connect basically from, where I live in North Nanaimo, pointed up at the top of Mount Benson, which is about 8 kilometers. Now, normally you wouldn't use this unit for an 8-kilometer hop. That's sort of pushing it, but it was able to connect it. It was able to talk, etc. But probably a better device for something of that distance or longer is the one you see below that, which is, it's about an 18-inch dish. They're manufactured, they're basically a plastic dish with, a screen mesh, for the signal, etc. And all of the electronics are built into that feed horn. So you don't have to, in this case, go out and buy a separate box for it, etc. It's all designed to operate. As I said, the only thing that changes when you get this device is you do have to download and flash the firmware on the device with the Arden firmware. And when you do that, it basically becomes a ham radio. We have a variety of the different bands, of which on the 5.8 gigahertz band has probably the best option for us, etc. So why do you want to do it? Okay, well, the major reason is, it's high-speed communications, and it's not dependent on other infrastructure. Okay, if you have an RF link, and if you, are able to have a line of sight to another node, and you have batteries, you're good to go. When the big one hits and all the power goes away and all the internet goes away, etc., you still have the ability to communicate, and once again, high speed. We'll talk about that in a slide or two, etc. And this is just another aspect of amateur radio. Even though that, like I said, the name Arden has the word emergency in it, there's a lot more things that you can do with it, etc. It's a project that's supported across the amateur community. It started with a group of guys down in California, I'm going to say 7 or 8 years ago. And they sort of said, hey, look at all this gear that's in the stores, and it's, cheap like borscht, and I bet we can do something with it. And they went to work and they basically developed this system. And when you look at it and get into the details, you realize that an awful lot of work has gone into making this, possible, etc. For us, when we started, it was experimentation. Can we do this? How will it work? How easy is it to get going, etc. What it brings as part of doing it, it gives you a lot of technical experience. Number one, with basically microwave communications, the trials and tribulations of 5.8 gigahertz, etc. And it provides new functionality that can be built on, etc. And you'll see when I say being widely used in the amateur community, a few slides down, it'll give you, a pretty good idea of just how much it's spread, etc. But once again, like I said, it's just the same as your home internet. Okay, it's just Wi-Fi, only very long distance. Okay, so this is not the first, what we're setting up with Arden on Vancouver Island is not the first mesh network that's, being used by the amateur community in British Columbia. You've probably heard of the BC Warn network. It came ahead of us, but fundamentally still using the same technology. The one difference is, they use it, they don't replace the firmware, they use the manufacturer's firmware for their links. But it is a mesh network, although the way they've implemented is largely with point-to-point links. So it's controlled access. They will connect to, EOCs that connect to club stations, things of that nature. And there they use some frequencies in the 2 or 3 or 5 gigahertz range, etc. And we have plans, probably in next year, to link from, linking from Mount Seymour over in Vancouver to Mount Copley which is one of the Landsfield foothills. And the idea there is to add an additional link for the BC Warn network. And so what you're seeing there in that schematic is the BC Warn network. And as I said, most of it is over in the Lower Mainland. The stuff that's here over on the side, that's up in the interior, and it's not a RF link to there, but they come in tunneling over the internet, etc. But most all of these links that you see here in the middle are all RF links, etc., from different locations and down to, specific locations in the Lower Mainland as such. And like I said, mostly club stations or EOCs or things of that nature. But where it gets interesting for us on the island, this link that you see over here, okay, it's running from UBC and it's coming across the strait and it's coming to the Nanaimo Regional Hospital here in Nanaimo. And from that location, it goes down south into the, Cowichan area, down to Duncan with a link to Mount Brenton. And it also goes north, not as far, but it goes up to our repeater site at the Lost Lake location at the V7DGA repeaters that are there, etc. And then it also has links that come down through the Gulf Islands, etc., coming down to Victoria. So, they've had time to build it out. It's a very capable network, etc. And so we've got a little challenge. We have to play catch up a little bit, but I'm seeing that the technology is similar and the functionality is useful. Now with Arden, okay, we've taken a somewhat different approach than they have with BC Warn. As I mentioned, they do point-to-point links. What we've done to try to get around the geographic constraints that we have, on the coast, on Vancouver Island in particular, is rather than doing point-to-point links, what we have done is we've basically put some sector antennas up at various high altitude sites. And what we're doing with that is those high altitude sector antennas are operating a little bit like a repeater. There's no smarts up there. They just basically sit at the top of the mountain. They listen to whoever's connecting. And then depending on who's connecting from down in the valley, they're either, when you connect to the sector antenna, you're talking to it. And most of the sites we've put multiple antennas in. So, you'll have one at the top of Mount Benson, and it'll be tied to another at the top of Mount Benson. And they're basically covering different areas. And with a sector antenna, they're available to be, cover a sector of 90 degrees, 45 degrees, 60 degrees, 90 degrees, 120 degrees. And mostly we've been using 90-degree ones, but we do have some 120s and a few 60s as well, depending on what is appropriate, etc. So, as I say, it's an alternate mesh network to the BC Warn one. What we do is we let people set up their own connections on RF. They can use, smaller dishes, or, well, once again, you can have tiny dishes, medium dishes, large dishes, really large dishes, okay, all set up down in the valley. And then we're using those sector antennas at the high elevation sites to link different people at different locations as such. You can also do point-to-point links. If you want to talk to your, within your town or city or to your neighbor across the street, etc., it's real easy to do. The biggest challenge, of course, is, trees. Trees get in the way. And in BC, we have lots and lots of trees. So that is often the constraining factor about doing this. Last Friday, we had a gent by the name of Orv Beach up from California, and he was putting on a talk for Arden, etc. And what really struck me when I looked at his pictures, where he's showing the different antennas and the different sites, etc. I mean, why does that look so different than what we have? Then I realized the only vegetation that they have to deal with is only sagebrush, that are like 3 or 4 feet above the ground. Whereas here in BC, Mother Nature decreed no tree should be less than 70 feet in height as such. So, this system is very widely based. It's being used all across North America and into Europe. What we're trying to do, as I said, is we're trying to provide open access, to people that are operating on a mobile basis or from the home QTHs. sites, etc. So it's a little different than what BC Warn does, where they're a lockdown network. We're saying, come, come everybody, come all. You'll be able to connect to our network if you can physically get it, in place, etc. Because it's very easy to set up. And when I talk about, being used across North America, this map here shows, all of the nodes, and this map is probably a few years older, as such, but there's a lot more dots on it than there is now. But you can see the areas where it's being used here, and you'll notice there's a lot of activity up in the, Vancouver Island area, etc. And considering we only started doing this about 3 years ago, it's been a lot of fun. We get a lot of people involved, etc. I said, if you go into some places, there's an awful lot of nodes. So what you're looking at there is, Southern California, LA, and you can see that they've really gone wild, etc. And if you look at San Francisco and some of the other, cities, particularly in California, because that's where it got started as such. But you can see an awful lot of connected nodes. And once again, it depends on how they're connected and whether they are using RF connections or they're using internet tunneling, etc. And I'll show you a little bit later, some of the information you can pull up from these maps, etc. And then I said over in Europe, once again, being used, all across Europe, not as many as North America, but if we were to look at today's map, I bet there'd be a lot more dots on there as such. And it's being used in Hawaii, Alaska, so it's got all sorts of things. And so if we talk, Vancouver Island and the Lower Mainland, this gives you a little bit of, an idea of the activity locally as such. And I have to really, point out that the gents over in Port Alberni are probably one of the first adopters, in BC. And so they have set it up to operate, for EmComm Communications in the Alberni Valley. They work with the city of Alberni and the regional district. And as such, you can see that they have this, pretty dense collection of nodes around the Alberni Valley, etc. Whereas what we've done is sort of been spreading it along the coast of the east coast of Vancouver Island. You see there's people over in the Sunshine Coast that are tying in, and then there's a variety of people that are doing this over in the Lower Mainland and down, in Northwest Washington as such. And you can see, basically the frequencies that the various nodes are operating on. And in many cases, many of these nodes are just the little HAP units, etc. People that haven't gotten along to getting into the RF side of it, or are constrained by their geography as such. So really, Ardent doesn't really do anything on its own. Okay, it's basically, infrastructure for high-speed communications. But to actually get a benefit out of it, it's really what you want to use it for, what sort of application you want to make use of as such. And so there's a lot of things that you can do with it. This is only a partial list. Obviously messaging and email. You can connect IP phones up into the network, etc. Full integration with WinLink for people that are using that tool for their EmComm or communications, etc. We're looking at using it to give us remote site maintenance and monitoring at repeater sites, etc. And we're also working to do remote station access and control. Recently, well, we're still just at the final steps of it, etc. But we're commissioning a remote access HF station at a new station here in Nanaimo, up at the 808 wing of the Royal Canadian Air Force Association at the Nanaimo military camp. And one of the components of that is going to be remote access to that HF gear using Ardent. Now, we're also going to be using the commercial internet, but once again, if that goes away, if you're connected up through Ardent, you'll still be able to access it. You can connect in, basically, you can send images or video over this connection. In many locations, people set them up with web cameras, at high elevation sites, so you can look out, do fire watch as such. And certainly down in California, they've done that extensively with some of the fire situations that they've had down there. People use it for repeater linking, whether it's DMR or C4FM, and keyboard to keyboard chat. It's really what you want to use it for, and it's only a function of your imagination as to what you can do. So, as I keep emphasizing the speed as such. So here's a bit of a comparison of different modes and the speeds that you're going to get. So conventional packet radio at 1200 baud. I stole this slide from Moore, but I think he was tongue-in-cheek saying, well, yeah, 1200 baud is 0.0012 megabits per second. Pactor, 5200 bits per second. Vera, 5800 to 20,000 bits per second. With Arden, your ham radio network links can be more than 100 megabits per second. Now, that's an optimum scenario, etc. We don't usually get it that high, but it's quite possible, once again, depending on configuration and location and distance and size of antenna, etc. But we usually have 10 to 20 megabits connectivity between our nodes, etc. So there's a lot of gear out there that you can use. I'm mostly going to be talking about either MikroTik gear or Ubiquiti gear, but there's also other manufacturers. Gear from TP-Link or GL-iNet also will work, quite well, etc. So if you don't really want to have a MikroTik cap, you can buy a unit from, TP-Link or GL-iNet as such. So I'll second. My other computer is bitching at me a little bit there. And once again, these access points, these antennas, or the MikroTik HAP routers, etc., all are loaded with custom firmware from Arden. And as such, they become ham radios, and then they can be used to create a ham radio IP network. So the communications is basically TCP IP, and that's why you have so much flexibility of what you can do with it as such. So, as I mentioned, 4 brands of equipment. At this slide says 70 plus different models. It's probably more like 200 plus different models, etc. And while it says operation in 4 ham bands, 2 gigahertz, 3 gigahertz, 5 gigahertz, and 900 megahertz, the reality of it is most people are operating up in the 5.8 gigahertz range because there's more flexibility there as such. And once again, if you don't have an RF connection, you can connect everything together using tunneling across the internet as such. What we have is we basically have operations in Part 97 only channels, so it's ham only with no unlicensed transmitters. Now, as we all know, spectrum is something that gets fought over, so that might change at some point in time. But for the moment, it's particularly good. And where we're doing it on Vancouver Island, you don't have the denseness, of signals and things like that you would have, if you were trying to do it over in Vancouver or as you saw down in LA, etc. So it works, but you're more likely to run into, some interference or constraints in a, particular urban area, etc. So the software, it basically, to make it easy, it provides your DNS and DHP services. It does the route discovery automatically and tracks the routing information. It makes it relatively easy to get set up and connected. Literally, if you've configured the radio with the same channel and the same, bandwidth on 2 different devices, you literally just have to point the 2 of them at each other and they will start talking. So as I said, you don't have to get into a lot of, elaborate network configuration or anything of that nature. And so as I mentioned, we're using the 5 gigahertz band. Mostly we started there because we had that existing equipment in the closet, etc. But as I say, you have the other bands that you can use. But you'll notice 900 megahertz, only 1 5 megahertz channel. 2.4 gigahertz, only 2 channels. 3 gigahertz, they had more channels, but down in the US, the government has clawed that back, from our use, etc. So I think there's still, multi-part usage, etc. But there's an indication it might go away. I don't think it's happened quite yet, but the certainly that is one of the possibilities. So that's why a lot of people end up on 5 gigahertz, etc. And here's, basically a listing of all of the channels and the frequencies that you could operate on 5.8 gigahertz. So from channel 131 to 184. So there's about 50 channels in there. Now, some of them are a little better than others, okay? You tend to want to operate in the lower to middle part of the band. When you get up in the upper channels, etc., there are some constraints and such, but certainly there's lots of room to play as such. And here in Canada, we have basically the same allocations, etc. Once again, we're always a secondary service, so, excuse me, you can get into a situation where, there is a commercial user or government user or whatever. But for the moment, particularly here on the coast, we don't have a lot of contention, etc. Okay, so once again, as I said, this gear is really nice to use. It's not very expensive. It's designed for outdoor use, etc. Weatherproof as such. And we have had, some of the sector antennas up on a high elevation mountaintop site for up to 3 years, and they're still chugging along. Well, I'll say they're still chugging along, except for one exception. We have had one piece of gear that's got a problem. We're going to have to go up and either update the firmware or replace the that particular unit, etc. But overall, what we have out there and what people are using, particularly down in the valley at the home locations, etc., the gear just keeps on working and keeps on working, etc. These units are dual channel, so they're MIMO, multiple input, multiple output. One of the signals is horizontally polarized, the other is vertically polarized, and that helps the signal cut through, etc. Now, this slide shows that we're using MIMO and 802.11n. Okay, the big news is that in the last year, we have a whole bunch of devices now that are able to operate on the 802.11 AC protocol as such, which is really a good thing because the older 802.11n equipment was starting to get long in the tooth and was not being produced by the manufacturers anymore. So now you can go out and get the AC equipment, and that guarantees that there's going to be, equipment available to people for whatever they want to do. Now, the good part about the old equipment is it started getting real cheap, and I could buy it off eBay for a fraction of the new cost as such. So I could buy a unit called a Rocket M5. I think I bought 13 units off of eBay on one purchase, and the average price was like $10 or $14 as such. So the old stuff in that sense is still quite nice, but the really old stuff, if you're talking, bullets or rockets that you get from Ubiquity, because of the constraints on the memory, etc., what we're trying to do is, okay, don't hook it up, just give it an easy retirement as such. But there's a lot of gear available, etc. And as I say here, don't purchase the old ones because they've only got 32 megabytes of RAM, whereas the new units have 128 or even 256 megabytes of RAM as such. So if you go onto the OregonMesh.org site, they have a clear list of everything that is available and workable as such. So once again, coming back to the basic unit, that really is sort of the quick entry to using this system, etc., is these Microtip caps. And this is an old unit, etc. You see it's got a white case. You'll also notice the price tag there, which is a very old price tag. If only the price stayed the same, etc. Nowadays here in Canada, you're probably paying about $90 to $100 for one of the original HAPs. And the other two models I showed you there, the AC2 and the AC3, they're a little more expensive. So I'd pay about $160 for an AC3 unit as such. But once again, you flash the firmware, change the manufacturer's firmware out, and load up the Arden firmware, etc. So why do you do that? And I'll just come back here for a second, and you'll notice, and this is not the greatest picture, etc., that the unit has 5 ports on it. Okay, and the first port allows you to connect into your local internet to the wide area network. The three ports in the middle are LAN ports, so you can connect any device into them. And the fifth port is designed to connect and power an external antenna, etc. And it's connecting device to device. You only have to run one wire, into the HAP unit. You also have the option to just plug 12 or 24 volts in to the normal sort of power plug. But from there, all of the power, all the connectivity to an external antenna goes out one cable, one Cat5 or Cat6 PoE, power over Ethernet cable, that connects to any external antenna that you've got, provides power to it. And if you add in an additional switch, you can have one cable coming out of the house from your HAP, and it can go into a device like a Ubiquiti Nano switch, which has one port in, three ports out. So if you want, you can actually have three external antennas all connected into the HAP unit, etc. And once again, those are not very expensive. You pay about $80 for a Ubiquiti Nano switch. And that's what we have in place on some of the mountaintop sites as such. But fundamentally, in addition, you have in each of these units, well, better bite my tongue here, the AC3 and the AC have two internal transceivers built into the unit. The AC2 unit does not have that, but the intention here is it's getting used for slightly different purposes as such. But the two transceivers that are built into the unit, one is 5 gigahertz, and it's designed to operate like basically like any Wi-Fi access point that you would have in your house. In fact, this presentation is coming to you over from this laptop that I'm hosting the pictures on, connected Wi-Fi to the MikroTik app that's in the other side of the basement, and from there, of course, we're going through the normal internet, etc. But as you can see here, it also has that ability to connect into an external antenna, and that external antenna is not just an antenna, it's also a node. It has its firmware flashed to run the Arden, etc. And as I said, that's what makes it a ham radio. It has the functionality, to automatically ID every 30 minutes and things of that nature. The other 2 gigahertz link, etc., is designed basically to be an extension of the mesh. So if I have two HAP units, one on this side of the house and one on the other side of the house, they are talking together just like any unit on the mesh as such. So I can connect Wi-Fi from my laptop on the 5 gigahertz transceiver, and then the 2 gigahertz will automatically established a mesh connection to any other HAP units that might be handy, sort of thing. And as I mentioned, port 5, PoE out to an external antenna. Ports 2, 3, and 4 can be connected to whatever device you want to connect to. Whether it's your laptop, a camera, talking to another computer or Raspberry Pi or whatever. And then, of course, port 1 goes into your home internet as such. So where that gets interesting is, say you're off, at a field day, or you're at an MCOM exercise where multiple people are there. This gives you the ability for all of those devices to be connected together as such. So you can have all the multiple laptops all connected via Wi-Fi to this one device. And by the same token, this one can talk to this one as such. So we've used it, for field days, trying to keep the different stations connected so that we can do logging, from all locations as such. So once again, what you do with it, how you use it, is totally up to your imagination, etc. So you don't have to have, this set up at your home QTH. It's perfectly good for doing mobile operations. In fact, that's where we started. We took some of this gear, and you'll notice these are metal antennas, okay? Slightly older Ubiquiti gear. You can see, the little guy is probably about 18 inches, and the big one is about 27 inches. And we have a nice 4-foot one tucked away as well. And we're going to be using that to have a connection across over to the BC Warren network, up on Mount Seymour as such. So certainly when it comes to gain and things of that nature, bigger is better. It is also, however, heavier and a little more cumbersome, etc. But yeah, you want to operate mobile. Remember, all of this gear will either, well, all the Microtech gear will work from 10 volts to 30 volts. The Ubiquiti gear, and both of these dishes are Ubiquiti, they're much happier operating on 24 volts as such. And like I said, the different sizes of antennas that you can use that are sold by Microtech. Bigger dishes, more gain, but a much narrower beam width, etc. So this dish happens to be one that, well, no, like I was going to say it was Microtech, but no, it's a Ubiquiti dish. But Microtech makes one of similar size, etc. And this is the type of gear that we would be putting up in high elevation sites. In other words, it's got to survive, winter weather, 120 mile per hour winds, things of that nature. But I did mention what we really had started with, and I'll just skip past. You'll notice that, you have the option. Either you can have, basically the whole electronic package built into the feed horn, like you see here. Or what we've done, like as I mentioned, we've put sector antennas up at high elevations. And there's, you have sector antennas available from Ubiquiti. They are probably more hardened. In other words, they're made out of metal, with a very high impact plastic on the front as such. And so the different sizes as such are reflected in the different gain. But the cost, once again, is not that expensive. The large sector antennas, between $150 and $195 Canadian. These little guys here, one of them is probably, let me think on this one. One of them is 120 degree. You get 16 dB a gain. I think the other one is maybe 90 degrees, and the gain goes up a little bit. You can sort of see how it changes with the larger antennas. You get more gain, but the bandwidth of the sector is much smaller as such. And for the other antennas, okay, for the ones that don't have the electronics built in, what you have the option is to basically have the transceiver, as you see here. This one for Microtech, this is the thing they call a B box. But for Ubiquiti gear, they have the equivalent, and that's a Ubiquiti Rocket M5. And you notice the dual channels, etc., the short little cables, so you don't have any cable loss, etc., because, all you're connecting to either of these is basically a link to Cat5 or Cat6 cable going down to either a HAP, or they can, operate with a separate PoE injector as such. And your Ethernet cable can have a run of up to 300 feet as such. Now, having said that, you'd probably want to operate those devices on 24 volts rather than 12 as such. But you've got a lot of flexibility of where you mount the antennas and things of that nature. In addition, if you happen to live in a, basically a restricted area, etc., and many of these HOA sites, basically have rules that say, yes, you get to have a satellite antenna. Well, you can take a used satellite antenna. In this case, you can see it's a Hughes or whatever, or, a TELUS one or Bell or whatever. And what they make available is a device called a Microtech LDF. I'm trying to remember gone out of my head, but LDF actually stands for nothing, but basically it replaces the satellite antenna feed horn that would normally come with these devices, etc. And it basically turns it into an Arden node, etc. And about the only thing is, because of the nature of the dish, it's not tilted back to point at a geostationary satellite. It basically is pointed sort of across the street or across the town or whatever. And you can get, like, these units have almost as much gain as those larger, conventional metal dishes as such. So we talk about how much equipment is available as such. I thought I'd give you a little bit of an idea as such, all of the items, all the different units that are available from Microtech. And, getting down into Ubiquiti, all this different gear. And you can see over here, how much memory they have, the newer devices, more memory, faster processor, things of that nature. So you got a lot of options in terms of what you want to use. Now, one really useful functionality for using the Arden network is you can connect up, voice over internet phones as such. And we have done that, here in the Mid-Island, etc. We actually have an Arden PBX that's set up, and a variety of our members have acquired the phones, plug them into that little HAP unit, etc. And you can basically pick up the phone, type in a 4-digit phone number, and you can basically be talking to somebody else up on Arden, either over RF, microwave RF, or over the tunneling through the internet, etc. And this is one of the areas where we were able to show the value as such. So some of you might have heard that about a year, I don't know, year and a half ago or whatever, they lost all communications over to Gabriola Island. There's a big storm, and the main communication line that runs from Vancouver Island to Mudge Island to Gabriola Island, on the Mudge to Gabriola link, etc., basically the wire broke off and it was hanging down into the salt chuck. So it took out all of their internet, all of their ATMs, all of their telephone connections. Basically, they were almost cut off. The RCMP were able to use their radios, but nobody could call out from Gabriola Island. However, at the Gabriola Fire Hall, at the Gabriola EOC there, we had an Arden node set up. One of the medium-sized dishes up on a tower. The dish was pointed up to Mount Benson, and we were able to give them communications back using an IP phone and using the Arden network as such. So that's what they had for about a day and a half. And then, of course, TELUS brought in a cow, a cell on wheels. So, but in the meantime, we were able to show the benefits of amateur radio in this sort of technology. So there's lots of these different phones that you can acquire. They're really cheap. You can buy them off eBay, etc., for $25, $30, $50 or whatever. And they're a nice addition as such. And like I say, the same thing, a whole bunch of different models that you can pick up. Some of them are more capable as such. And once again, Arden is just, a technology for connectivity, etc. It's really up to you what you want to do with it. One of the more interesting ones that I've heard about coming out of Washington State is when you have a disaster and you have a lot of people that are evacuated, to reception centers as such. What they did there is they gave everybody a wristband with a barcode on it. So as people came into the reception center, as they got bused from that location to another location, each and every time somebody would scan, their barcode, and that information was collected and transferred over the Arden network as such. So they were able to track where people were, where the people had gone, things of that nature. But once again, it's really up to you what you want to do with it. It's just TCP/IP communications, so any device that'll operate on that protocol can be connected into this sort of thing. Also, fully integrated in with WinLink. Okay, WinLink will operate with a variety of protocols. Packet, ALE, APRS. Vera HF, Vera FM. You choose what you want to do with it, etc. But you can also use, WinLink connected into your Arden mesh, etc. And once again, the advantage is you're transmitting at 10 MIPS, as opposed to, a much slower speed as such. So at this point, I'm going to just quickly stop. Does anybody have any questions of any of the stuff that I've been showing you at all? Okay, I will continue on. And, variety of applications, whether you're talking texting, um, chat sites like Mattermost or Rocket Chat or whatever, whether you're doing things, with a variety of operating systems, etc. There's a whole bunch of things that you can do as such. And in fact, you can also just connect to that, Arden node, the little HAP unit that I was playing with there, using your phone or your tablet, because they can connect just with the, standard Wi-Fi as such. And, here's an example of what the one operation they did down at an exercise down in California as such. And, to move hospital traffic, they had basically gateway access, peer-to-peer. They did a variety of things with their exercise. And I guess what I'm saying is we have multiple tools, and not any one of them is the only solution. This is just one tool in the toolkit, and depending on the circumstance, a tool like WinLink, supported on a variety of different platforms, gives you a lot of flexibility as to what you do. So where are we on what we've been able to do to this point on Vancouver Island? We've been doing this now for just under 3 years. What you see, we started, like I mentioned, the very first time we gave this a try, we went up on a hill in North Nanaimo, and we pointed our dish down to VA7DXX's location, David Evans, and we connected 22 kilometers, and then went a little further north and we're connected 28 kilometers, etc. So David had one of the first sector antennas up. Then Devon, VE7 LSE, he has a tower across the harbor from Ladysmith, and he put 2 sector antennas up on his tower there. And he pointed one of them up north towards Nanaimo and one of them south down towards Salt Spring Island. Since then, we've gone operational with more sector antennas up on Mount Benson. And I'll show you some pictures of that. But we're bit by bit building it out. We've got plans, hopefully this year, to put 3 sector antennas on a location called Cottle Hill. And that's a commercial site that has 4, commercial towers on it, etc. And our idea there is we will have basically 360-degree coverage. Because right now, most of our coverage is single threaded through Mount Benson. Fantastic location. The only downside is in the winter, you can't really get up there without either a helicopter or a snowmobile, or in some cases, they've actually gone in, with snowshoes, etc. But it's not something that you get to too easily, etc. And, I've always been concerned that since we're single threaded through there, we want to have alternates. And that's what we're hoping to do with the antennas at Cottle Hill. Cottle Hill, as such, is actually located somewhat in the middle of Nanaimo, a little bit to the north, etc. But it really is, the alternate site for any operations in Nanaimo. Mount Copley, which is one of the Lancefield foothills, we have plans for later this year to, get in there and get a repeater site set up, to get Arden sites set up, pointed at Parksville. Also, that link that I mentioned across to the lower mainland for a 3rd BC Warren link coming across to Vancouver Island. And then what we've done this in the last, well, actually, not this, when was it? Yeah, it would have been last September. We went into Mount Copley, and I know Mount Copley and Mount Copley, and Mount Copley is beside Arrowsmith, etc. And up on the shoulder of Mount Copley, there's the VE7KU repeater site. So now it's operational. We have 3 antennas up there. Okay, one is pointed down Parksville Qualicum area, one is pointed up to Comox Courtney, and the 3rd one, which is a dish antenna, is pointed down into the Alberni Valley to tie in their mesh there. At our Lost Lake repeater site, which is just north of Departure Bay, up on the coast, etc., 650-foot elevation. We have a site there with one sector antenna, which is pointed over at the Sunshine Coast so that they can come in and connect to the Arden network. And they're coming about 35 miles to do that. Salt Spring Island, they've got a site operational towards the north end of Salt Spring, etc., and it's connecting different sites on the island. But in addition, they have the ability from Salt Spring to connect to Devin Banman's, one of his antennas up at the Ladysmith site as such. And as I mentioned, the Alberni Valley had the mesh in there probably longer than anybody. They've probably been working on it six or more years, etc. We're hopeful that also this year, over on the Sunshine Coast side, they're looking to install some antennas over there. And the idea is, right now we have a sector antenna here on our side that's pointed at them so they can come in. The plan is to put a sector antenna over on the Sunshine Coast side, so anybody on the Vancouver Island side that looks out across the strait, they'll be able to point an antenna across at the Sunshine Coast. And if you know the geography of Nanaimo, there's a very large north slope part of Nanaimo, which has a large ridge behind it. So a lot of people there, they can't point an antenna to Mount Benson because there's that great big rock ridge in the way. But they will be able to, we hope, be able to point their antenna straight across the strait to the Sunshine Coast, which will then be connected back over to this side. So it'll all be part of the mesh, etc. Similarly, down in the Comox area, etc., we're doing some tests down there. We found that we were getting good connectivity. In that case, from the North Island College, they had a dish that was pointed up at that VE7KU site at one of the sector antennas there, and they were coming in about 35 miles and getting really good signal levels and things like that. So we're hopeful that they'll be able to move forward and getting some antennas there that'll tie them in through the VE7KU site. And then they have plans to actually put some antennas up on Mount Washington to once again provide more coverage, hopefully over to Powell River, hopefully coming down, to Qualicum Bay, Qualicum Beach as such. And from that location, we're also hoping that the second sector antenna will from that site be able to point down at Campbell River. And, it's a never-ending sort of thing. We're hoping to get lots more in place, maybe start getting into what I call bounce sites as such. So maybe high elevation sites that are not actually at a commercial, radio installation, but something that's out in the woods, set in a, on the edge of a high level cut block, etc. Basically, a suitcase, a solar panel, and an antenna, and we'll, operate there totally on solar power and hopefully with security via obscurity as such. So we're going to have to see if we'll be able to get some of those in place, hopefully being able to partner with, people like Mosaic Forest, etc. And there, hopefully one of the things that'll attract them is the whole idea of having those cameras basically doing fire watch from different locations. So I talk about Mount Benson, okay? And there's a picture of Mount Benson. You can see it's lovely big and sitting right behind Nanaimo as such. And it was really the first one where we sort of did this as a club activity. We were able to raise the money to do this with donations from club members as such. And that's what you see from up on top of Mount Benson. So a fantastic view, a fantastic location for radios. Now, there are a number of ham radio repeaters up at that site. The site is owned by Island Communication, and the owner of the company, Sudo Postila, has been very supportive of amateur radio activity, etc. So when we went to him and said, Sudo, we want to put some of these sector antennas up there, and he gave us lots of assistance and everything like that. And certainly you see that picture, you can understand why we wanted to have antennas up there. And there's the installation up on top of, their building up on top of the mountain. What you're seeing there is basically two sector antennas. And you'll notice that there's basically an aluminum shield built around each of the sector antennas. And then there's a piece of aluminum up on top of both of the antennas. And the reason for that, you don't see it here. Well, I guess you get a little bit of a hint over here. There are two towers on either end of the building that are up much higher than this. And in the winter, they accumulate ice, and sometimes the ice blows off and falls down. So what we were trying to do was provide some, protection for the antennas. And as I mentioned, so far it's worked very well. We survived 2 winters with no problem. Unfortunately, just before winter this year, we noticed that we were having a problem with this antenna, talking device to device to this antenna. So we got to get up there this spring and, do some fixing, etc. But even so, no problems for 2.5 years. And there's a bit of a different picture of the building up there. And as you mentioned, there's the 2 towers on either side of the building. And there's some interesting pictures they have showing what large chunks of ice falling off those towers, what sort of damage they can do as such. And we talked about Cottle Hill. Here's a picture of Cottle Hill. What we are hoping to be able to do this summer is on this tower here. These 2 towers also belong to Island Communications, and we're hopeful to be able to put 3 sector antennas up at about this level to give us 360-degree coverage all across Nanaimo and also over to the Sunshine Coast, and maybe for some people that are able to get in from the Lower Mainland as well. And we're trying to work from the concept of having a backbone link and then have relay links, and then of course the idea is that anybody who can see, has line of sight on any of the high elevation antennas that we've got up there, they can operate then from down in the valley, pointed at the higher elevation sites, or even these sites can be just somewhere in Nanaimo, as long as you from your home or from your vehicle have a line of sight to the antenna, you're connected into the mesh. And the idea is that for whatever reason we were to lose the backbone that you see sort of painted in here, the mesh won't go away because it'll basically go on an alternate route. And it tries to pick the best route possible. But as I say, it's self-healing up to a point, and it's very easy to set up. So where do you start? Well, obviously you look around and find a useful mountain, preferably a mountain with a radio site that has power. That's the preference. However, having said that, we have sites that are running strictly on solar as such. But you want to look at what you can do from where you're located as such. Ubiquity has a web-based tool they call, well, it used to be called AirLink. It's actually had a name change, etc. But what it lets you do is it lets you, call up a screen, bring up an image of an area, and it'll show you, you can put a sector antenna at a location, and you can say, okay, show me a 120-degree sector antenna. It'll show you, where the coverage is, and to some extent, what sort of signal strength you're likely to get. So I have great dreams of being able to get sector antenna either up on, the road up to the Capilano ski resort, etc. Or what we're also hoping to do is from over, Mount Seymour. I think it's right there was the ski resort of Mount Seymour. Maybe one up there, and start getting some more of the, the Lower Mainland people involved in this. But like I say, it's a web-based tool. Anybody can use it. It's a fantastic thing. It has its peculiarities, okay? When you go in and you set up a site and say, okay, I want to put an antenna here, it automatically gives you a 60-meter tower. Don't we all wish we had that? So then you change things a little bit, shrink it down and say, okay, my tower is only going to be about 12 feet, etc. So you have a more realistic view of what sort of connection you got. And then you change something and you find that the software will go in and basically throw your antenna up 60 meters again. So it's a great tool, but it's got its peculiarities as well. Another tool you can use, it's one called Radio Fresnel. And with these microwave links, etc., you don't get just a straight line of signal, etc. That signal starts out as a point source, and then it basically grows and grows, and basically becomes, a circular antenna path, what you call a Fresnel zone. And this tool is beautiful. You can say, okay, it's tied in with Google Earth. You can put in the Latin long of a site, in this case, one of the towers at Cottle Hill, and you can specify what frequency it operates at. And then, of course, you go to the other end and, basically pick the location that your signal is going to go through, and it'll build this image that you then can display in Google Earth. And one of the things that you can do is you can zoom down, using Google Earth, and it'll show you the actual signal path. It'll show you where it goes over top of a building, whether it goes beside a tower, whatever. It is really amazing what this will allow you to see. Are you missing that tree in your neighbor's yard, 100 feet away? Are you missing the neighbor's house? If the Fresnel zone is running above the house, you're laughing. But one of the challenges, of course, is if there's something that impinges on this, Fresnel zone, etc., it'll impact your signal path, etc. But yeah, start with these two tools. Look at where you're located, where you'd like to be pointed at, where and while I've been emphasizing high elevation sites, etc., it can also be, pointed at your neighbor a block away or a mile away or 2 miles away. You put basically the locations into one or other of these tools, and you can truly see whether it's viable. And I'm not showing you this on this screen, but you can actually see basically the signal. Say you got the antenna up here, and you're living over here in Langley. It'll also show you basically the terrain coverage and whether there's any ridges or any other geographic features that get in the way. What it doesn't do is it doesn't take into account the damn trees. Okay, so that's a bit of a wild card with this particular tool, but that's where this other tool, Radio Fresnel, will, depending on the location, etc., as you drill down on Google Earth, you can see whether you're missing the trees or whether you're going right through something or whatever. So, this is a really good place to start to try to figure out, is it possible for me to connect to another location? What are the possibilities as such? So I mentioned we have these various high sites, etc. Devin had sector antennas down at his site in Ladysmith across the harbor. He has 2 sector antennas, one pointed down towards the southeast, one pointed towards the northwest up to Nanaimo. And you can see the sort of coverage. And, one of the things you can do is you can basically, drag this cone out, you drag it all the way up to Nanaimo, and you can see what the sort of coverage is. Up on Mount Benson, here's the 2 sector antennas that we've got up there. One pointed to the northwest, one pointed to the southeast. And you can see, fairly effectively where there's coverage, but also where there's not coverage as such. So a good example of that is, some of the Lancefield foothills and Notch Hill on the other side of Nanoose Bay, they block your signal. So you can see that area, you're out of luck, sort of thing. But from up in Mount Benson, people up in Qualicum, well, Parksville and also up to Qualicum Bay can tie in from those locations to those antennas up on Mount Benson. When we finally get into Mount Copley, which, as I mentioned, is one of the Lancefield foothills, at that point in time, we'll then be able to provide coverage, to the folks in Nanoose Bay, etc. So some of you might know Tom Marshall, V7TOM. He's desperately waiting for us to get that antenna in place because he's right about there. And we had great plans to actually get an antenna right up at the summit of Mount Copley. as such. And look at the coverage that's got. But unfortunately, it wasn't going to happen. Two things. A number of years ago, at that site, they had a large calm shell with big solar panels on it, etc. And in the middle of winter, somebody called up, Island Communications and said, you know, your calm shell that's up there, it's gone. It's been blown off the mountain and it's down in the valley, sort of thing. So it wasn't really possible for us to go into that particular site as such. But the VE7KU site, as I said, is on the shoulder of Mount Coakley, so it's probably right about here. So it's maybe not as high as the summit, but it does have almost the same coverage, down to Parksville. Doesn't, get down this far, etc., like the one at the summit does, but you can see. We had some plans to put something over on, Muscogee Island, and that might still happen. Once again, providing that coverage back to people on the waterfront in the Parksville Qualicum area, etc. Also there's one guy over here on Hornby Island, right about here, and he'll be able to make use of the site that we have at the VE7KU repeater site. So bit by bit, it builds out. And, I talk about VE7KU. Here's another view of using the same tool, slightly different way. Bright red means you've got really good coverage, etc. And then you can see how it sort of shades off to yellow right here. And then you get on the other side of the Coombs Highway here, and it's getting blocked by a ridge that's right up here as such. And then, the links down into Port Alberni, etc. So now we've got coverage into the Albernis, into Qualicum and Parksville. And what I'm not showing on it here is also from up here, coverage up to Courtenay, Comox, Fanny Bay, all along the way, etc. So, where do you find more information about Arden, etc.? Well, we do have, some pages on the NARA webpage talking about the Mid-Island Arden Mesh Network, etc. Gives you a little bit of a introduction to it, etc. We do tech talks. I've done a number of these talks for different clubs, etc. Basically trying to provide information about how you start, what you can buy, and then the critical thing, will you be able to operate with an RF link from your QTH as such? And once again, the trees are the challenge. The geography is the challenge. And that's why we really like to have sort of alternate nodes, basically one on this side of the strait servicing the other side over the Sunshine Coast. And when they get their node over there, that will now provide a whole bunch of people that live on the shore, on the Vancouver Island side, the ability to tie in as well. Beyond that, you can have a lot of fun with this, and you're helping the community as such. So, and okay, here's another shot of it, etc. This is where we were looking at, coming across from Texada Island. And we've still got some thoughts about right up here, up on the top of Mount Pocahontas, would be a fantastic location. Once again, providing more coverage into the Courtenay Comox area, etc. And while this map doesn't really show it, there's the VE7KU site, and beautiful red coverage up here. Oops. In Courtenay, etc. We basically set up a test antenna up there, and they were getting a 32 decibel signal noise ratio in the connection from there, etc. So once again, the bigger the dish and the clearer the signal path, you can do all sorts of things. Okay, well, we were trying, when this presentation was put together, we were trying to talk people into basically supporting this project, making contributions, etc. Because we, to actually build that equipment up on the top of Mount Benson, we needed some sector antennas, some Ethernet cabling, some PoE adapters, etc., and also some batteries, etc. And once again, like I said, it's surprising me, how inexpensive this installation can be if you have power, okay? If you don't have power, and an example of that is the VE7KU site, which is totally solar, we are just probably in 2 weeks from now going up there, taking up 800 watts worth of panels, 4 AGM batteries, and you know, fairly Skookum charge controller, etc., and setting up a totally separate power supply from the one that, you know, is servicing the VE7KU repeater. And the idea then is that we will basically be able to keep things operational through the winter. You know, we did run through the winter, but the folks with the Aerosmith Club that were, you know, maintaining and monitoring the repeater site would check the voltages, and if things started dropping, you know, they'd turn off the Ardent signal, etc., and just keep operating with the regular repeater. You know, hopefully, if we get things installed in the next couple of weeks, we will be good to operate out of there year round. Once again, depends on how many clouds there are in January and February, etc. But at least it's a start, and we hope to have that in place, like I say, in two weeks' time. Once again, you can see some idea of, you know, the activity that's happening, you know, on Vancouver Island, etc. And as I said, there are more, you know, more little dots. You know, this is what I call the measles diagram. You know, the spots keep popping up here, there, and everywhere, sort of thing. Okay, so when you're actually using Ardent, quickly, what I'd like to do is show you what you see when you are connected. And so I will stop the share here. And what I'm going to try doing is, and bear with me here. Oh, come on. Just find the particular window that I want to find. Right, there we go. Okay, I will now share this screen. There we go. So what you're seeing here is you are seeing my little HAP unit in, you know, the other side of the basement, okay, that I'm connected to via Wi-Fi from the laptop right here. And when you first go in, it gives you this, you know, overview screen. It shows you, you know, the various IP addresses that the unit is talking on. It shows you, you know, what the firmware level is. Right now, I'm running the most recent, you know, standard release of the firmware. They also put out daily releases, and some of the people that are, you know, a little more active than I am, they will load up a new version of firmware on a day-by-day basis, because as changes are made, as new features are rolled out, they show up in that daily release, etc. And of course, they want people to basically be able to, you know, keep up to date and test those new releases, things of that nature. In this case, you know, I am, let's think on this one. What have we got here? Okay, so my HAP, obviously it's not doing anything, you know, it's in the basement, it's not doing anything from an RF perspective, okay, with an external antenna. I do have an external antenna up on the roof, okay, but I have to go up there, and I think I've had a cable failure as such. So I got to get up on the roof and either put in a new cable or replace the antenna. So, but from here, click on what's called mesh status. And now you can see all of the things that I'm connected to from my little HAP unit over on the other side of the basement. You know, I'm tunneled in this case to Devin Banman, who's down in Ladysmith. He is kind enough to host me on a, you know, with a tunnel connection, etc. And then you can see, you know, his nodes as such. You know, he's got one node that's on his house that's pointed up the slope to his towers that are probably, I don't know, I'll say 500 feet away, etc. He's shooting through some trees as such. But all of these other sites that you can see are all part of the Vancouver Island mesh. And you'll notice that the vast majority of people are, you know, are just doing it using tunneling. But those ones that don't say tunnel after it, these are actually RF links, you know, going, you know, out in different directions, etc. And so you can see there's an awful lot of things connected into the mesh. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to this, where is it? This site. This is VE7GDE, Jack Olson. Some of you might know him, etc. So I'm going to, he has, excuse me, He has a HAP there, but up on top of his roof, he has one of the dishes. And like I say, a dish is just another node. It's running the Arden firmware, etc. So I will connect to his dish on top of his roof, and it gives me the detail for VE7 GDE Benson link. I'll click on the mesh status, and you'll notice he has a neighbor. One of the neighbors is one of the antennas that is up on top of the mountain, VE7NA Mount Benson Southeast. I'll click on that, and now I'm connected to that node that's up on top of the mountain. And if we look at the mesh status for that node that's up on top of the mountain, you'll notice there's a whole bunch of antennas down in the valley that are pointed up at that mountaintop node. So VA7DXX Benson Link, he's down by Ladysmith. VA7GFD Gabriola Fire Department, they have an antenna pointed up at Mount Benson. VA7WTB, Wanda, get her last name now. She lives on Gabriola. She's connected in, etc. The one that I came in from, Jack Olson's, this is viewing it from up on top of the mountain as such. At the new radio station that we're putting in at the Nanaimo military camp at the 808 Wing building, it's connected in as well as such. So you can see the different ones that are connected together. Also, there's two antennas up there, and this one here, VE7NA Mount Benson Northeast, is the one that hasn't been working all the time, but I notice it's popped up. So, but you'll notice here, it's got a problem. If I try to connect through externally to this node up there, it's not really going to connect. So the guys up in Parksville Qualicum will not be connecting in, etc. But over here, you can see basically, some indication of the sort of speed that we get from the different locations. Once again, depending on, the location, whether there's trees in the way, the size of the dish, things of that nature. Some locations are working better than other locations, etc. And it's reflected a little bit in terms of the speed that you can access. So 21 MIPS versus 19.5, 13.13. And as I mentioned, my antenna, up on top of my roof I got to replace the cabling, and it would also normally be pointed at the Mount Benson Northeast site. So there's repairs that have to happen here and up on the mountain, etc. And once again, as I said, all of these connections that are available either via RF or via tunneling as such. And we have people that tunnel in from, over in Alberta. You'll notice VE6 stations in here, things of that nature. So there's lots and lots, even if you only have a HAP connected to your computer, plugged into your internet, you have the ability to connect to all of these locations. This one here, VE7MIR, Mid-Island Radio, up on VE7KU, pointed to the northwest. Let me think. Let's see here. If I go up there, there's probably nobody operating from Courtney Comox right at the moment as such. But I mentioned, okay, we are pointed down from the VE7KU site up on the mountain. There's a dish pointed down into the Alberni Valley going to their landfill link site. So if I click on that, now I'm connected to that node up on top of VE7KU, pointed down into the Alberni Valley. And now you can see, these are the nodes that are down in the Alberni Valley, and these are part of the ones that are part of the EMCOM system in the Alberni Valley. You can see they're all RF links largely as such. So you can sort of get an idea. There's an awful lot that you can connect to as such. And see if bear with me. Also, we have the concept of supernodes, okay, which are, are in the process of being built out, so that rather than having to, look at a great long list of nodes that are tied into the mesh. Now we can have a supernode set up in Nanaimo that talks to other supernodes around North America. So it simplifies the connectivity, things of that nature as such. And so Orff Beach was kind enough to bring up a brand new HAP AC2 that we're going to set up at at the military camp, and that will be our supernode connection to other, supernodes across North America. And it just then simplifies, the whole build out of this mesh as such. Okay, let me think on this one. Bear with me. As such, also, I should mention the upgrades that are done to the firmware on the different sites. This is not at the moment the most updated firmware, etc. So as it gets upgraded, you'll find additional buttons and things that you can do with it, etc. But I know that this is, current as of last September. So we need to upgrade it. And the thing is, you can upgrade the firmware remotely. You do not have to be on site. Okay. You can actually just connect through. You can transfer an updated version of the firmware, upgrade it in place, which is really useful for mountaintop sites. But the downside is if you foobarred, because it is at a mountaintop site, you might have to figure a way to get up there, etc. And if it's in the middle of winter, it might be a problem. That's one of the reasons why we have not updated those nodes up on Mount Benson. We wanted to wait until the weather was better, so we knew that if we did cause a problem, we'd be able to get up there physically, etc. So once you're connected like this, bear with me here. I'm just gonna go in and do a little find, and I'm going to look for Devin Badman's. Oops. 2 keyboards in front of me, and I can never, guarantee my fingers are going to go to the right one. So we'll do a search for V7LSC. And so we'll connect to Devin. Like I say, he's down in Ladysmith. Brings up his status page. And we'll go into the mesh status. And so Devin is basically hosting a variety of services. And the one that's sort of fun to look at, he's hosting flight tracking, which many of you might have, used locally sort of thing, over the internet or whatever. So now I'm going to go in, and what we're seeing here, or we'll see in a moment, etc. Here's flight tracking, being set up at Devin's place in Ladysmith. And of course, it's not the most active time of the night it happens. Normally we'd see a variety of aircraft, etc. But you can see if I click on that little icon, there's an aircraft, whatever. Well, they don't tell us what aircraft type, so obviously it's a small one, flying at 2,500 feet at 86 knots, etc. But
it's a Cessna 172, Chris.
Okay, yeah, that sounds about right, Ron.
But, hey, Chris.
Yes.
Chris, been about an hour and a half here now, so are you just about finished? I don't want to bug in on a really
no, I'm
interesting presentation.
Right there. So I'll stop sharing on this one. I'll just come back to the presentation and we'll wrap it up in a moment. Bear with me here. One computer is kind enough to bitch and complain about something else, and it puts a blue bar across as such. Let's see. Bear with me. One of the challenges always is you have different screens and you have different things there, etc. Okay, so here's the PowerPoint again, and we will share that, and then we'll bring this up to a conclusion. No, bear with me, that was not the screen I wanted to click on. Quickly do this, and let's see. think this is the one. Yeah, okay. So we're back into the presentation, etc. As I mentioned, we're looking to have an extension of BC Warren system, etc. Hope to have that happen maybe this year or early next year. When we talk about Mount Copley, here's the site up on the top of the Lanцeville foothills, and what you're seeing there is in early days, they're basically a reservoir site to support the foothills development down there. This reservoir, which they're just putting the foundation in, now it's 120 feet long, 60 feet wide, and 20 feet high. And it's going to be the first of 4 that are up there. One here, one here, one here, one here. But the beauty of us is from a repeater site or an Arden site, it's a great location. Okay, we talked about the sort of equipment that you can start with and what we started with, etc. Once again, we tend to use Microtik and Ubiquity gear, but there are other manufacturers as such. So the other interesting thing that I wanted to mention, and this is not Arden per se, but it's a little device called New Packet Radio. Okay, an NPR 70. It's a system that was developed by an amateur over in France, and it operates on 440 megahertz, or more specifically, the frequency we're coordinated with is 433.3 here in BC as such. And it's designed to operate either point to point or master to up to 7 clients as such. And I talk about those damn trees all the time. What we're hoping is that we'll be able to use these units to sort of take care of that last couple of miles. If you live in a site where you can't do RF to an Arden node, it's distinctly possible you'll be able to use this, which also does TCP/IP communications. And there's a case where they set up an NPR link down on Salt Spring Island. It's about 30 miles that they set up, etc. And once again, TCP/IP, they were able to bring up websites and things of that nature. Once again, there's a lot of information out there on the actual ardenmesh.org site. Try visiting it. You'll be absolutely amazed as to how much information is there, how much is available on the Facebook page, how much is available on YouTube, etc. And what we're hoping, here's a view of the island trunk system and some of the plans or thoughts that we have moving forward, so that we'll not just be, VHF, UHF, etc. That maybe at some point in time we will be able to do, some of this microwave stuff. And I'll just mention this one link that you see here is running from down in Nanaimo all the way up to Newcastle Ridge up by Kelsey Bay. That's a 220-kilometer link. Once again on 5.8, gigahertz, etc. Amazing. And we're hoping other sites. This is up on Little Mountain, and I talk about sort of basically bounce sites out in the wilderness. A suitcase, a solar panel, and some dishes, etc. If you're a little more ambitious, etc. Once one of you donates the helicopter, etc., we'll get into this side of things, etc. And in the third world, where they don't have telephone systems and things of that nature, this is how they're able to improve their communications. So on that note, that is my presentation. Thank you very much, folks, for the opportunity to show you all of this.
Hey, Chris, this has just been